Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn comment response. The Brooklyn class comment response. It's kind of interesting. I always pick the video which has had the most comments from the previous week for the comment response, as a rule. And I have to admit, I do filter the comments because some of those are advertisements for very, very dodgy sounding versions of new currency, let's call it. Yeah, not going there. And other things. Persons of negotiable virtue, perhaps. Neither which are particularly interesting. And then you have, of course, also the other comments, which I do enjoy, of we love this class, which are not really questions, though, that I can answer and respond to. Other than saying, thank you, I agree. That's why I did a video about them. So, here's a Brooklyn class, which had nearly 80 comments overall so far, and the vast majority of them have been actually interesting questions that I can answer. So we can start off with Admiral Tiberius, because he started off a discussion. Oh, I do so love the Brooklyn class, one of my favourite ship classes ever. The Japanese learned the hard way how effective 15 6-inch guns with semi-automatic loading could be in a more than one naval battle. In particular, USS Helena, with its joyful message of "Have you met my friend, the 152mm AP shell?" I've got lots of friends just like him. In fact, I've got hundreds. Here you go. I'd love to be the fire control gunnery officer on board a ship like that. I imagine the Boise and Helena fire control gunnery officer nearly passed out from sheer pleasure when the captain ordered the guns to continuous fire. All guns fire at will, rapid fire. Okay. For the first few seconds, it is amazing, I'm sure, because they're thinking, woohoo, we finally get to do our job. We're doing everything. Everything's firing. But then, after a certain amount of time, less time than you think, it suddenly turns to worry, because actually firing the guns can damage the ship themselves. They can damage the barrels. You can fire the guns enough that you can actually warp the barrels through heat, and then you start missing the target. The repeated percussion of firing the guns, especially on full auto, doesn't give anything in the turret time to reset or the ship time to reset from the vibrations, which can cause damage throughout the whole ship. So, yes, it's great, but also there are issues. You know, it's great for the first few seconds, and then it's a case of, okay, watching the gun barrels, watching turret rings, watching machinery. Because it's all designed to take a certain level of punishment. But the thing is, firing guns, especially on full auto, has a habit of exceeding anyone's idea of what the punishment they were designed to be, to take, was supposed to be. DF, I spy on RTX 3060. Yes. Which came with a very, very cool graphics case. Let's be honest, that is very cool looking at that Tiger. And it's actually a very, very cool... It seems to be a very good graphics card. Seems to be working very nicely for me. Yeah, nice girlfriend. Yeah, Brooklyn defied the Indian breakers, most likely the Alang shipbreaking yard. I bet you had a lot to say about how Argentina treated their Brooklyn-class cruisers. You heard some of it in the video. Boise deserved better than she had in final years, and Phoenix, I could rant how controversy is stupid, but bluntly, Thatcher should have told Diana Gould on BBC Nationwide on Spot back on 24th of May 1983, when she was asked that we were at war and Belgrano had to be sunk because she was a threat that had to be destroyed. Luevos, the loss of Phoenix Belgrano was sad but necessary under the rules of engagement in the Falklands conflict. The Boise, I will pine over, having worked hard to get the city to help restore USS Boise monument downtown in the park. I would say the Belgrano is a powerful unit. It is a powerful ship. You only have to look at the sheer amount of force the British were dispatching to try and take it on. There was a surface action group formed. There was the very inappropriately named Captain Coward put in charge. He had all sorts of ships at his disposal, including his own Type 22 frigate, which didn't have a deck gun. He had all sorts of random frigates which were available, which had 4.5-inch guns, put together into a force, and they were going to sail down. And they actually were heading in that direction. They had the surface action group formed, they were heading in that direction. That was how big a threat it was considered. They get into the area, they get sunk. One of the things I would point out in sort of this map does sort of show, and many others have sort of considered, is that it is skirting the area. It's skirting the exclusion zone. It's not heading home. You'd be going off in a tangent and getting further and further away from the exclusion zone. If you're going backwards and forwards across the exclusion zone, entry point, you are flirting with it. And you are a threat. You get engaged. Right. Thumper 83, Dr. Clarke, that is the reason for the line drawing. Said Savannah Honolulu became, because after the USS Savannah got hit with Fritz X, she came back to Philadelphia and Naval Yard and was rebuilt to resemble St. Louis and Helena. She did have quite a lot of work. And then there's a whole discussion which goes on to what she's doing. The fact that she's not deployed into combat zone straight away after she's finished and completed. I don't agree with the assessment by some that this is because she's forever weakened and is forever a bad hull after this point. It's not the case. What is the case is that after you've rebuilt a ship, you don't have to train up the crew. And she's used as a training ship to send people out to other ships, which is going to lengthen the time it's going to take to generate her a crew as well. It is possibly a very useful use of her. They have enough Clevelands, they have enough other vessels on the front line, they don't need to send her. But also, you've got a ship which you've upgraded to quite a high degree and quite a high capability. In this case, Savannah, post-rebuild. And what does that give you? That gives you a ship you can deploy if you need to. That's the point. You can deploy it if you need to deploy it. You can deploy it if one of those ships gets damaged. Sending it, there is this sort of popular mythology that sometimes goes around that the idea is that you send all your best units straight to the front. And you do that in a computer game. Because to build more, it's just a click. You do it. You send them all. Boom, 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 boom. And you just keep clicking away, and you have fixed defenses and all sorts of things, and that's what you do in a strategic computer game. In reality, you don't. In reality, you often keep some of your better units back. To filter forward and replace better units when they are damaged, to filter forward and replace better units when you need to withdraw them for their own recuperation, to replace better units when they're sunk. So, yeah, she's kept back. It makes sense. Plus, you would want to be careful with a ship after you've just done a major reconstructive surgery on her. You'd want to make sure that that surgery is holding. So you'd want to test her out a little bit more. You wouldn't just commission her and send her straight into war fighting. You would if you had no other choice. But if you have a choice, you don't. You test it out first and go, I did good. I great surgeon. It hold. Always interesting. Being able to get away, which seems to make all the Ordnance Forward scheme a retrograde step. Same with 3 turrets forward and 2 aft. Is it possible the Cult Offensive still ruled the Marshall Roost? I hope you don't mind a brief aside on Tone Class Harvey Scout Carrier Escort Cruisers. An 8-inch gun cruiser not meant to fight enemy ships. A cruiser not meant to fight its enemy opposites. I've discussed this one before when I did Japanese heavy cruisers. If one is aware of the extreme import the Japanese attach to embarrassment, then one might see today's Hoegas as an in-your-face gesture to show that old enemies USA cough that the aviation cruiser concept was valid and their ancestors vindicated by the court of time. No. Let's be honest, all ships these days are to an extent an aviation ship. They can carry drones. They carry missiles, which provide a form of airstrike. They then carry helicopters. Some of them then carry more helicopters. Some of them carry fixed-wing aircraft. And you have carriers. And they go from being the least orientated around aviation to the most orientated around aviation. But every ship is, to an extent, orientated around aviation. It's... Basically, the world has... That's how the world's evolved. Fire from the sky. However, I did answer to this as well with the discussion on the first part. You have to remember they run headfirst into the enemy hunting them. They would then have to turn to a draw. The most dangerous time is the turn, in which case the forward guns are pretty darn useful. And later, plus when withdrawing they'll probably zigzag away to try to throw off enemy gunners' aim, so will allow forward guns to fire when they do. Plus, scouting is not their only role. Fighting other light cruisers, destroyers, escorting carriers and diplomacy also matter, which has an impact on layout too, so that helps. Basically, any ship design is a compromise. Any ship design is a compromise. And it's a compromise between many different roles, because especially once you're building something the size of 10,000 tons, you're not building it for a single mission. Or if you are, you have a massive navy and can I come work for you? Because you obviously have more money than sense. Most of these things, once you get to above a certain tonnage, they become general purpose assets. They're orientated one way or the other, maybe, but they're general purpose assets. And that's really the reason once you get above... Honestly, if you look at any ship which is over 3,000 tons, they become more and more a general purpose asset the heavier they get. People turn around and go, well, that's an air defense destroyer. Yes, but at nearly 12,000 tons, it also carries how many land attack missiles? Anti-ship missiles? Guns? Helicopters which can do ASW warfare? Yes, it's an air defense destroyer. But it's basically a general purpose destroyer A, in capital A. Some of them are lowercase a. In brackets, basically. That's it. So it's sort of a GPD bracket A, or GPD bracket lowercase a. Because it really is general purpose. And part of being general purpose is being able to take on aircraft. That is actually part of it. Because you could theoretically have something which was a strike cruiser or a anti-ship cruiser which didn't have any anti-aircraft capability. You could point to these ships and go, well, you know, they have 6-inch guns. Those aren't A1 guns, but they also have their 4-inch guns. And their 5-inch guns in terms of cruisers. 4-inch in terms of British cruisers, 5-inch in terms of the American cruisers. And those were very capable of dealing with aircraft and of doing the outer area air defense in terms of the gun version of it. You always have to remember that there is a very big difference between modern air defense and World War II era air defense, because today we use missiles where we talk about killing our opponent, about knocking them out the sky. In World War II, the doctrine is very different, because you have fighters which break up strikes into smaller penny packet groups, maybe 1s, 2s and 3s. You then have the heavy guns, which are supposed to provide enough blast effect and enough explosive power booming off above them that they break up those strikes then into 1s and guarantee single aircraft strikes. And then it's when a single aircraft coming in, that's when the 40mm etc. are supposed to start doing the killing. But it's all the sort of form of filtration, so it's not necessarily a kill requirement. So this is why it's quite funny when people turn around and go, oh, they should have carried less of the 5-inch guns or less of the 4-inch guns or more 40mm or this, that. And I sit there and go, well, then you're missing what those guns are for. And trust me, you do not want to be in the ship which has a lot of 40mm but is getting attacked by groups of 3 or 4 aircraft. Because then you won't take them all down before they take you out. Whereas you do want to be in the ship which those tracks are broken up into single aircraft. You have slightly less 40mm, but you still have plenty enough to kill that single aircraft before it drops its bombs or torpedoes. And that's the point. That's 631. So what political liability would the British Royal Navy have found itself in had it sunk the carrier and the cruiser? Sinking the 2 most powerful vessels in the Argentine Navy would be, to an extent, overkill. It's one of the reasons why the British were very careful with the Vulcan bomber. It could overfly the Falklands as a demonstration that we could hit the Argentine mainland, but we couldn't actually hit the Argentine mainland. We could put the idea in their head, but actually doing that would probably lead to trouble in the UN. Basically, you're allowed to be far more powerful than your opponent, but if you want to stand up for the good moral order of the United Nations and the global order, you have to exercise restraint when deploying that. A question. How many warships were forced by exigency, or enabled by cupidity, to blow their planes over the side when the main battery fired at an inopportune moment? Further, was this accepted as a design consideration before wartime experience brought up the objection? Now, there's a whole discussion that starts off on this between Derp Squad, Scooter, ATF YouTube Division, and William Cox. Now, my purpose I will add in is this. You have a lift and a hangar. The aircraft are usually kept down there. If we go back to this position though, unless if the guns are firing broadside, there's going to be no impact on an aircraft. You might launch an aircraft, but the odds are you launch the aircraft before you get into engagement range, because it's going to provide spotting, or it's being launched as a dawn patrol for reconnaissance, or these sort of things. The only time you would have a scenario where you could maybe be surprised is if you were surprised literally at dawn, pre-radar, and the enemy was close enough to you that they were straight in engagement range, but had been far enough away from you that you had still brought up the aircraft from the hangar, loaded on the catapult, and were about to launch it. Which is such a absolute 1 in a trillion shot. It never happens. Battle of the River Plate. The British have launched their aircraft. Actually, the British launch their aircraft, and remember their catapults are in a different position. They're in the center of the ship, and they are launched off between blasts of the guns. So basically, it goes boom, boom, and yeah, they are launched. Berthold von Zagen. I love the idea somewhere on Taiwan there's a coastal defense battery of 15 6-inch guns from one scrapped there. We'll never know. But I would be... As the experience of the Russians have found in Ukraine, they invaded and fought the Ukrainians first in 2014. They've had 8 years to prepare. 8 years to reform their army. 8 years of continual fighting, reforming their army. And the problem with that is, if you're deploying your full force, the ones who survive will tend to be the ones who are either lucky or good. If you are deploying only partial of your force, then tends to what happens, and we've seen this in lots of different militaries. The people who come back who've got combat experience, the people who haven't had the opportunity tend to be jealous of them and do everything they can to smite that experience being passed on, for fear of losing their own positions to people who've been lucky enough to go and get the combat experience. You can see this in lots of militaries. It's something you have to be very careful about managing. The British fell to it after the Falklands War. We can see that with the treatment of Sandy Woodward, but also the treatment of Michael Clarke, of a fair number of other officers down there, who were still, oh yes, but we'd scheduled you to resign because we presumed that any other officer we'd sent down there in your position would have done just as good a job as you. It ignores the fact that no other position officer, they were the officer who went down and now have that experience. And then they panicked and tried to call them back later. And when they wouldn't return, they were very rude about them. But those people had left the service, found new jobs, settled their families, and the Navy wants to call them back to serve, and says, oh yeah, we need you for about another 12 months. So you want to uproot them for 12 months. I can see why they didn't want to come back. You're not giving them any guaranteed years of, promotion, all those things. You're not giving them years of service. You're telling them they have to now uproot their entire family again for a year. Experience which is hard fought for needs to be held onto. And you need to be sensible about it. Bull from Chicago. This is basically why I own 100 books in the RN and about 4 on the USN. Hell, I think more about books. I have more books on the Coast Guard than the Navy. Now, then it gets into a whole discussion about indigenous populations versus segregation and all these things. Now, here's the point. I was making a design point about the US, and there were some people who came back to me and went, well, you know, you still would need X number of toilets and X number of this and that and the ship. And that's true, but when you're designing around segregation, you're putting in splits and separations, etc. And actually, this though is not necessarily, how do I put this, not without its benefit to think about. Because nowadays we of course have mixed gender ships, which is good. Please note, I'm a big fan of this. Why? Well, here's the thing. A, women have been going to sea for a long time. B, as war has gone on, whilst the still healthy part of it is about this, a lot more of it's become about this. If you're maintaining a modern ship, it's about maintaining the electronics, maintaining the computers, maintaining all those systems. It's about communications, data management, all these sort of skills. Now, the thing is, the number of people in the population who can manage all that successfully is actually not as great as we'd like to, and not as great a pool as we'd like to think. And if you start going, right then, we're not going to take one group of you because of your biology, you're in trouble. Because that's a huge section of population. We're going to lose 50% of the access of that pool, possibly. Because of that, you're in problems. So you need to design a ship around it. This is where actually the lessons of segregated ships become quite handy. Because you need to start thinking about how you balance these things out to make sure there is space. Because ideally you don't probably want the bathrooms on top of each other and next to each other. And that's purely from a logistics perspective than anything. As well as a ship personnel management perspective. But I do find it interesting that that comment led to all that debate in the comments. It's an interesting one, because when I was looking at it, I then went and looked and made a comment. I thought about the Royal Indian Navy, I thought about the various circumstances. The British in those sort of navies manage segregation very differently. Basically, the sailors' quarters are all the lascars, the Indian sailors, as they called them at the time. And then you have the officers are mostly British. And basically they were just doing that version of segregation which has always existed in ships between officers, petty officers, and crew. And that's there for an entirely different reason. That's there for people to be able to relax. Because, believe it or not, you can't be a 19-year-old probably letting your hair down and having fun if your version of, well, your boss is sitting right next to you. Most bosses. And the thing is, it won't just be your boss. It'll be your boss's boss, and your boss's boss's boss. And they all feel responsible for you, and they have to maintain a certain code of conduct. So they can't turn off, because they have to pay attention to what you're doing. And you can't turn off, because you have to behave yourself in front of them. And the petty officers have to sit in the middle and manage it all. This is why we have the separate spaces. It lets them go and relax. Carl Pennypacker. I think I'm not different when I say I adored it in the Brooklands. The Independent Seaboard Museum here in Philadelphia, where I live, has a beautiful model of USS Philadelphia. Shockadair, and it's gorgeous, well painted and detailed. I also think they are prettiest cruiser built, and I'm a big fan of the New Orleans class too. Also, why did the US not put exterior belt armor over the magazine, instead of opting for what seems like internal subdivision with thicker plates below the waterline? weight, i.e. displacement on the treaty limitations, hull shaping, and also, this is going to sound strange, the internal weight structure of the ship. And you have to do a lot more work to put that around. So they went with the way they did, because it keeps and allows them to build the ship out like the hull like they did. 96 everyone. Hey Doc, how likely is it the UK government in the 50s and 60s were concerned that the Americans might try to do a coup that puts a military junta in the government in the UK? Not very. If you're going to start doing a coup of a military junta, the first thing you need to do is make sure you're training that nation's military. That's why you invite their officers to your officer schools. Gives you that opening. Very, very few British officers train abroad, and that's all after Sandhurst. The British military is eminently clubbable, but it's also eminently intertwined. And I realised there has been some very interesting episodes of The Crown, where a certain retired admiral was getting up to issues. I would be very doubtful that that has any basis in reality. Stardust based on his own ability to organise things, but more importantly, based on the fact that the British have other ways of dealing with these things, of getting rid of people. It's never a junta. There are other options, and it's been well-worn path in British politics of getting rid of people. We need to see recent events to see that there are various capabilities of doing that. Right. Yeah, in any alternative timeline, from 9681 again, in any alternative timeline where the British had a better equipped equipment, the carrier sunk. What I expect most likely would happen in that case. May 25th, 1982, two CVA-1 class carriers have their AWACS up and detect the Vincent de Meyer and her escort. Given how much the threat the carrier was, the Blackburn Blackburns with F4K Phantom, 2 escorts, are dispatched on a carrier strike, avoiding the wind drop that scuppers the Argentine strike later that day, and they hit the carrier group, likely doing a lot of damage. How much is hard to say, but I don't believe the carrier would survive because her 12 40mm both of the AI guns are useless against a Buccaneer. It's hard to say how the Buccaneers would attack the carrier. Bombs or Matra Martel anti-ship missiles. As for the escorts, hard to say what happens to them. The afternoon, HMS Conqueror sinks Belgrano, as happens as follows. Well, I actually made some phone calls about this, and I know I talked about this in last night's live. And I know I said I recorded this last night. I had done, but I decided to re-record it because I wanted to go into more detail on this particular question. I made a phone call to not just one, not just two, not just three, but 5 different Buccaneer officers, pilots and observers. And I put this question to them because I thought it was interesting. How would they have done it? It's very simple. First strike would have been missiles. Second wave would have been bombs. So they'd have first sets of aircraft would come in and launched missiles. They would have been probably unescorted by the Phantoms. Diving in, launching missiles, diving off. Phantoms would have been congregated in the second wave with the Buccaneers. They would have come in to provide cover against any air defences and suppressing air defences as they came in, with jamming pods, etc. Anything that's still going after the missile strike. And the bombers would go in and take their targets. Priority would be the carrier, secondaries would be the escorts. Take it out and all is good. Let's see. Marcus Fransonium, a naval history question. Belgium Navy are on or now you see, now you don't, and colonial history. How is it possible that the colonial power of Belgium was the Congo and some minor posts in the Far East and Tangiers did not have a navy, and how did it begin? A bit of Belgium Congo fit into World War II? Another question is, what if question is exact. The Belgian government was in negotiations to colonise the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1843. Unfortunately, the contract fell through as the company that they negotiated with, Ladd & Co., got into financial difficulties. How would events turn out, and what effect would it have had if Hawaii indeed became a Belgian colony? Well, that's an interesting one. Now, my strong suspicion is America, when it's in its expansionist mode, during the Spanish-American War might end up going for Hawaii as well, because that's an important step on their path to the Far East, to the Far East for Europe, to Asia for America, which they see as something they can use. Now, the thing is, if they do that, then it turns into a mass European war, because the Treaty of London, signatories including, thank you, Christina Rodriguez, I don't think you've ever commented before, so thank you very much. This is the first comment I've definitely of yours I read. Austria, Belgium, France, German Confederation, Netherlands, Russia, and the UK. Which would have been a very interesting world war, and possibly involved Anglo-German troops being landed in Canada to go south, and possibly an amphibious assault on Washington again, a la War of 1812. It would probably have involved the Americans finding their ships getting cut off around the world as they didn't have access to British colliers, which would mean they'd have a lot of penny packets around the world which could quickly get swallowed up. The Americans would more than likely lose, because they don't yet have the resource, industry, or infrastructure to take on the kind of capabilities the Europeans could have put together. It wouldn't have been an easy fight. I'm fairly sure the Franco-Mexican assaults, which would come from the south, would run into trouble in Texas, etc. Whether it would still succeed if it had enough troops, I don't know. I can honestly not say, because the American army would be being run ragged. But the Americans have just been through the Civil War not that long ago, so they have a large group of veteran troops who they can call upon. Now, admittedly, most of those veteran troops are now in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, but that's a huge leavening to the younger people when you're mobilizing a mass army. And they've done the logistics and the organisation for a mass army, so I don't think the ground war would be particularly easy. I think the sea war would be problematic, and I think that would cause a lot of trouble for the Americans. I think the war would either be over very quickly, or it would turn into a long-running affair, which could end up with America taking over Mexico and Canada. If it goes on longer, their ground forces can mobilise, they can carry on, and they can build their industry, and they can start fighting back and taking a land war. If it's a shorter war, because they get scared by the fact that so many people are reacting to them, then you probably have a scenario where America is significantly humbled, but becomes a sort of almost bleeding sore, in that she will be looking for not revenge, but to get even. And so there could be so the entire first half of the 20th century could become very different. I also think you would probably have a Russian army coming into Alaska, because the Russians would consider that a very good thing to go and get Alaska and have it guaranteed by the British, and then they've got the money. They've both got the money from Americans, and they get Alaska back, and they can probably go in and attack down the Americans' western seaboard as well. So you could be facing a truly huge military force heading to America. It would be truly massive. What would happen, how it would coordinate, and whether or not there'd be another world marshal appointed is an interesting thing, a la Boxer Rebellion. If the Americans left Hawaii alone, well, then I have a feeling in 1940, you probably get the Americans either inviting the Free Belgians to go to Hawaii and set up their base there, and then the Americans setting up a base with them to support them, or a la what the British did with Iceland. Basically, that is what would be going on. If you think the Americans would not behave the same as the British with Iceland, just remember who garrisoned Iceland and Greenland very quickly after the British arrived. The British arrived, took them, and then handed them over to the Americans to maintain their neutrality. It was a very good agreement. The Americans didn't want to do the dirty work. The British had to, because they couldn't afford the Germans going there. You might have the same thing happening in Hawaii. HMS Liverpool turns up, takes Hawaii, and then the Americans turn up and declare its neutrality. Fila Brill, also going to give you credit for your pronunciation of hometown of Reykjavik, Iceland. Not easy city name for foreigners nor non-native Iceland speakers. Did get St. Louis wrong. I pronounce it St. Louis when it's apparently St. Louis. But you spell it St. Louis. Why? Why? But yeah, I have an advantage when it comes to Reykjavik. Reykjavik, etc. is a lovely place. The Blue Lagoon, I have not yet been. It's tempting. I like Iceland is a lovely country and I like it a lot. Reykjavik, I'd hoped you addressed Helena's role in the loss of Juno during the withdrawal from the Battle of Guadalcanal, November 13th, 1942. I didn't get into this because there's only so much time I want. I was prepared to put into a video which was already going to be 106 minutes long. I like to try and keep the videos to roughly an hour. And that was nearly heading towards 2 hours. But honestly, that's a scenario where you don't have good choice. In British terms, that's where they call for a Traber-class destroyer. And I hope they had one of those there. Because you ideally need a gun destroyer which can operate solo. And you need enough of them that you can leave one behind while still having escort for your group out. But if you have a damaged destroyer and a damaged cruiser, and you have one good cruiser and one good destroyer, that's your escort for those damaged ships. And whilst saving the lives would be lovely and is what you would hope to do in a bit, and hope to do if you had the chance, you can't guarantee that saving those lives won't cost you a lot more lives and a lot more ships. And you need to husband the resources you have. If you had one more destroyer or something small like that, it would probably have been left behind to basically stay as long as it could before it had to before getting out before sunrise. But it's not a good position to be in. James Cannon, continuous rapid fire, and especially with the 5-inch mounts joining in, the Brooklyn-class cruiser could keep up a continuous stream of shells in the air. Once on target, it could rock the ladder in a range to make it difficult for the target to escape. This kind of radar-controlled fire and maximum range was useful to break up enemy torpedo attacks. Yes, the same as it's also used. The 5-inch guns, etc., from all the ships, will be used to break up enemy air attacks. And then we have another discussion of Savannah, which was hit by the German Fritz radio-controlled bomber Salerno. It penetrated the roof of number 3 turret, passed down 3 decks, exploded in a lower handling room, blew a hole in the keel, and killed something like 1/5 of the crew. Now, it never saw combat again, but it was repaired. Well, yeah, again, as I said, when you're doing and repairing that amount of damage, the surgeon's going to want to check before it goes into action. Let's put it this way, if the nuclear bombs hadn't worked out and hadn't been dropped on Japan, or the Japanese hadn't surrendered, and the Americans realized they only had 2, and it was going to be months before they could get them all working, and someone decided to go ahead with the invasion, you'd have probably seen Savannah take part then, because they needed her then. But at the point they didn't need her, they could afford to test out the system. Becca family, in regards to your comment about defense of Masafi, Morocco, the Office of Naval Intelligence had a report that provides explanation. Only the landing in North Africa, pages 7 to 9. Battery Realus consisted of 430mm guns in concrete placement with a fire control station and modern rangefinder. The battery 2 miles to the south of Safi consisted of 355mm field guns, presumably in open placements, maybe something similar to US coastal artillery Panama mounts. This explained why the USN thought the battery Realus was more powerful defense, since it would have been more difficult to destroy in concrete placements. Thank you. Seam White, like USS Boys, most of all, probably too important for use in the Asiatic theatre, but I keep thinking that she could have achieved at the Battle of Java Sea. Imagine her speed and rapid fire of its armament could have equalised or almost equalised the battle. Okay, she would have probably been cut in half by a long lance, but there was a chance she would severely damage a Japanese heavy cruiser enough for the rest of the fleet to succeed. There's always a chance. Navy Review, I find it interesting that Scheme B has a broken deck. I wonder why. Well, if we go quickly to Scheme B, it's weight saving. It's literally about saving weight. If you drop off that deck, you save weight. I like them too. I do have to admit, as I've gotten older, I've come to the opinion that the 5-inch secondaries on cruisers and battleships were a waste. Better have more 40. Hindsight, I know. Well, Navy Reviewer, as I've explained a couple of times on this, the 40s are for one thing, the 5-inch guns are for the other thing. The 5-inch guns are for long range, as far as you can with guns, breaking up the strikes. So you have the air defense goes, outer air defense is fighters. They break up the strike into sort of groups of 3, 4, 1 or 2 hopefully, but 3 or 4 maximum. So they break it up into flights. And then the heavy artillery breaks the flights up into individual aircraft. And then the 40mm deals with the individual aircraft. That is how it works when it works well. That is the plan, and that is a very sensible route to go. Right then. Thank you. That's answered all the questions. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you've found the series interesting. And I hope you found the US cruisers interesting. There is more to come on US cruisers. There are definitely more to come. I have an entire Excel spreadsheet of stuff which I am working on. It's always fun to do so. It's currently titled September to November, because it started off with September to November, but now it's also got December stuff loaded into it. And yeah, it's gonna be interesting. It is. But what I'm looking forward to most in terms of the American ships coming up, and this is going to be in the Christmas specials period, is of course we have Wichita, which is going to be on the 14th of December. We have Long Beach, which is on the 22nd of September. The Albany, Leigh, and Belknap classes, which are the 26th, 27th, and 28th of December. And US nuclear-powered cruisers on the 30th. And the 31st is going to be the Ticonderoga class. And then on the 2nd of January will be the US Treaty cruisers in War and Retrospect. Hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching. Bye. And thank you again for all your support. I wouldn't be able to do all this without you all, and yeah, it really does mean a lot. Thank you.